Welcome back. This is week 10, lecture 1, the failure of the Reformation. And this is a rather odd week, actually, because I ended last lecture, week 9, lecture 2, with a section and discussion of the failure of the Reformation, the failed Reformation. I've already talked about the failure of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And so why am I devoting an entire lecture to a topic I've already covered in so many ways? Because indeed, I would stand by what I said in the previous lecture about the so-called failure theses. Um, I just wanted to take a bit more time to talk about it because it gets at some central issues over and above the, let's say, almost banal question of was the Reformation a success or a failure? It gets into issues of how we conceive the past as such and what influence and impact those conceptions have on our understanding of the past. Now, I'll be talking a fair amount today. One of you'll notice if you look at the PowerPoint slide in the singular, one of the sections is the grand narrative, which I'll be getting to. And I posted for one of the readings this week an essay, basically, that I wrote. I won't go into the whole background to that, on narrative and creating the past. It's actually kind of a part or a partial study for my on history, which I had mentioned, I believe. This is not required reading. Let me make that clear. So it's not part of the course material as such. If you're interested, it's there for you. I think you could get something out of it by reading it, going into more depth. Some of the concepts I'll be talking about today. But in many ways, it's like the textbook reading from Lindner. No, sorry. Lindbergh. I'm sorry. Mind blank went there. From Lindbergh on the Reformation, when I say suggested reading, if you need more context, more detail, those kinds of aspects. So the posting of the reading for this week includes chapter 8 of my Lutheran Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, which has the title, The Failure of the Reformation. And there too I go into more depth in terms of concepts and perspectives and how we approach it. And that is part of the course material, and that is required. But the Word document that I posted, narrative and creating the past, is not part of the course material. You will not be examined on that, so to speak. But this does then sort of wrap up, or at least a nice pause in our pursuit of this course and where we're going and where we've been. Even though it makes this week rather odd because this lecture is kind of a summing up, overview, stepping back, taking stock, so to speak. And then in the second lecture for this week, we start with John Calvin. And that gets at, in a general sense, what we can call differing patterns of the Reformation. Now, if you haven't looked at your final exam yet, you probably should. Because your final exam is an important part of the course. And the text analyses, as you know, you have 4 text analyses. Those 2 are part of the course and are very important. They are designed to help you prepare yourself for the final, though. That's what they're really getting at. And the final exam question is essentially, was the Reformation a revolution or not? If so, why? And if not, why not? And if so, why? How so? In what respects was it so? And I hope you know, I think I said this in the guide too, that if I didn't, I should have. There's no right or wrong answer. You can say, yes, it was. You can say, no, it wasn't. You can say, well, in some respects, it was. In other respects, it wasn't. You can make the question what you want to make of it. And I believe I stipulate, too, in answering the questions, you'll need to deal with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Luther's Reformation, and then various patterns of Reformation. So Calvin is very much one of those patterns of the Reformation, and that's what we'll be looking at after this lecture, from this point on in many ways, even though we'll come back and pick up some of the loose ends and tie off the story, so to speak, in terms of the empire. And so this, too, is very much a part of the final exam, or at least the Calvinists. This lecture as such, I'm not going to be asking you to, critique my view of the failure thesis. That is not the question itself, but it helps with conceptualizing what it is that we've been studying and how we construct the meaning that we find in the past. I've said before, I think that meaning, maybe I haven't said it here so much, meaning is that which we attribute to the extant evidence. All that we have are the extant sources. And you've been reading some. That's what the text analysis are all based on. And you'll be reading more. I could have, for example, just going back with the Calvin issue, I could have assigned Calvin's prefatory letter to Francis I of his Institutes this week, since the second lecture of this week will be focusing on Calvin. But I saved it for next week, and I'll talk about that more next week, or even maybe in the next lecture. So for this week, you just have to read chapter 8 of Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. And then I would encourage you, if you are so inclined, to read, or at least read through the document, my essay narrative, and Creating the Past. Because that will help with approaching the question, was the Reformation a success or failure? Because it's dealing with conceptualization, as is that question itself. That question, was the Reformation a success or a failure, gets at how do we approach and come to an understanding of what the extant evidence signifies had happened. The Reformation is over and gone with. There's no such thing that is the Reformation that we can study. It is a categorical term that we use to refer to a series of events that are over and done with. And the only way we know about those events, the only way we know about the people who were part of those events, who effected those events, are by means of the extant evidence that is still with us today. So often we forget that, and we approach something like the Reformation as a thing in itself that we're then trying to learn, and then use the evidence as support for those conceptions. The trick is to flip it around, because that is actually backwards. We need to look at the evidence, the text, the documents, the artifacts, the other types of artifacts, because I refer to text too as artifacts, the ruins, the buildings that are still here, and those kinds of things, to reconstruct what this thing, the Reformation, was. And how we do so is based to a large extent on how we conceive of the past, how we conceive of the process of reconstructing the past, thereby creating the past, and all the meaning that we bring to things. Now, this has been a long, kind of rambling introduction, not necessarily out of the ordinary, except maybe a little bit longer than usual. But it is to approach this problem and this concept, because when Gerald Strauss put forward the thesis that the Reformation failed, and then later clarified that he was being very precise in that if we look at the reformers, Luthers and Melanchthons and others too, their intent for what they were trying to achieve, namely a new understanding, a theological understanding of Christianity based on the visitation reports, it failed, because the visitation reports showed such a dismal lack of a new understanding, whereby Lutherans who had been living as Lutherans for maybe almost a decade, or at least a good number of years, had not really learned that much at all, who were still more or less as quote unquote superstitious as they had been previously. So that this endeavor, this intent of what we are trying to achieve, did not achieve that, and then Strauss says that is a failure. Now, why is that important? I'll be coming back to that question later. But first, I want to have another, in some ways, introductory section, but it's section 1 there on the PowerPoint slide, getting out of our heads. Getting out of our own heads. Getting out of our own heads. Because in so many ways, to be an historian, we need to do that. And that's what this is all about. That's what the conceptions are about. And that's why the failure thesis has been so, in my view, has been so important. Whether you view the Reformation as a failure or as a success, the thesis itself is important. And we'll get there when we get there. First, getting out of our own heads. We view the world by means of our own perspective. And the means of our own perspective is how we are brought up, context in which we are brought up, our education and background, everything that has gone in all of our experiences, everything that's gone in to make us who we are right now at the point of observation. And all those things are stored in our memory. They're stored in our own view of reality and our own view of the world. It's called a world view in English, or a Weltanschauung in German, which has a bit more technical aspect to it. And we all have them, and they are all unique, even if there's a lot of overlap between some. People of the same family, people of the same culture, have a lot in common. Others don't. I'm not saying they have everything in common. If you know anything about families, even let's say the quote unquote traditional family, you'll know that the wonderful and loving mother, father, and children all getting along wonderfully together is not really very often the reality. Even in very, very good families, there's a lot of conflict and argument and discussion and disagreement and individuality. Now, I'm not getting into individual psychology or family psychology or anything else here, which I have no expertise in whatsoever. It's just observational. But my point here is that we are all unique individuals, and so even if we share a lot, our own individual worldview, based on our own experience and background, etc., 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 is unique. So often when we are confronted with new experiences or new information, what we strive to do, at least first of all, is to somehow figure out how that fits into our own worldview. We try to appropriate it for ourselves, or simply say, no, I'm not going to deal with it. I can maybe recognize it intellectually, but I'm not going to make it my own, so to speak, by trying to do the work to say, how does that fit in with my whole construct? That is, let's say, absorbing new things, new experiences, new information into our own worldview. Now, by doing so, our own worldview expands without question. That's different from what I'm meaning here in terms of getting out of our own heads. Let's say there are two different ways to go to a zoo. I'm assuming a lot of you have been to a zoo, if not most of you, if not all of you. And you can go to the zoo to say, oh, look at these interesting animals. Isn't this really neat? Let's look at this and this and this, and oh, how fun. Let's go look at the lions. Oh, let's look at the lions. They're so great. And that then can expand your worldview. It can also then just reinforce what you think about it already. The other way to go to the zoo is to say, you know what? I'm entering into a world that is completely other, that is completely not me. The point is not to absorb this into my own worldview, but to try to get a glimpse into what the world of these animals is like, and or would be like, or could be like in nature. And the whole purpose of a zoo is not for entertainment. The purpose of a zoo is to study the animals to help deal with the populations in the wild, so to speak, for at least for a decent zoo and a good zoo. Also to preserve the animals and help them with those kinds of things. Yes, yes, yes. And then to educate the public. And part of that is accepting both approaches to visiting a zoo. Number one, going to the zoo to say, look what I can see that will help me understand things better. And the other is to go to the zoo precisely because you want to get out of your own head, because you want to see, to the extent possible, something else, the other, so to speak. That other. What is the other? We can divide everything between ourselves, the self, and the other. And so often we blur that distinction because we are all, as I said, unique individuals, and therefore everything else is the other, even if we're very familiar with it. I don't know if you've had this experience or not. I did, but not until very, very late. I've had it with different people in different ways, but with my parents. We know our parents as we know our parents. We have a relationship to them and with them. And it's difficult to see them as other than our parents. And when I became a parent, it starts you to think and wonder, because it's like, you know what? When I had my youngest child, I was the same age as my father when he and my mom had me. I mean, I was the second child. But I was the same age. And it's like, you know what? I can't really imagine my father being like me. I can't imagine my father as that 36-year-old who is having a new baby, having the same feelings, the same thoughts, the same worries, the same fears. Because my father was always out there, even though we were relatively close, at least comparatively so, for a while. We had our problems and our issues and all kinds of things there. That's not the point here, though. But, you know, my father was familiar to me because I knew my father as my father, as an individual in and of himself. As the other, he was completely foreign in many ways. It was only when we were in high school, maybe even college, we had met some of his fraternity brothers before, but one came to visit us where we lived. And it turned out my dad was the beer chugging champion of his fraternity. And I'm looking at my dad and I thought, you got to be kidding me. And he's just laughing and turning all red, as he would often do. And we're thinking, oh my God. It's one thing to think of my dad. I knew he was in a fraternity, but to think of him as a beer chugging champion, I can't imagine that. So all of a sudden you start getting these glimpses into your parents being other than your parents, being as themselves individuals. And that can be a real shock. That's what I'm meaning by the other, and getting out of our own heads. It's a difficult process, and it takes work. And that is what history is about. When we go not only to a zoo, but to visit a foreign country, a foreign culture, foreign to us where we are, it's the same thing as going to a zoo. We can either go and say, oh, look at the interesting people. Isn't it kind of cute that they do things that way? But to try to understand it from their perspective and allow that perspective to not to be absorbed in our own worldview, but to challenge it, to question it. Why do I think the world is the way it is? Why? When other people, the other, view it in ways that I have a difficult time even understanding how that is possible. How could someone see things like that? Now, this is not the same to say that we just have to accept the other. But trying to come to an understanding of it, I would argue, is important, whatever the other is. And we need to recognize what falls into that category of the other, which is basically everything except for ourselves. And to see that distance, that we're not just trying to subsume all the other into our own worldview, into our own minds, but that we allow ourselves to be questioned by the other, just as a foreign country, in your own native country, wherever that might be. A foreign country, a foreign culture, there's no such thing, unified, there's no such thing as German culture. And maybe at a very high level, they can see some commonalities, but Germany is very diverse. France is very diverse. Go culturally, but to allow ourselves to be questioned by it. Why do we view it? Why do I view things the way I do? That's not to say that they do it right and I do it wrong. This is not a right or wrong kind of a position or experience. It is a seeking and a questioning. I may find that how the other is absolutely vile in my view, and I reject it. I would argue, as I have, that if we're really going to understand World War II and Hitler and the Nazis, we have to try to understand it before we condemn it. So let's put our condemnation on the shelf and try to understand it. Why do we think that, exterminating over 6 million people is wrong? Why do we think that? A footnote, I do too think it's wrong. But why? Why didn't Hitler see it that way and his cronies who were, carrying out the Holocaust? Why didn't they see it that way? Can we come to an understanding of it? Can we come to an understanding of the terrorists who bombed us and attacked us in 9/11? Or do we just condemn? It's easy to condemn. But can we understand it and ask the question, why? Why? How do they see things so radically different? What have we missed? What have we gotten wrong? Why do we assume that everybody wants to be like us? Those are the questions that force us out of our own heads, out of our own minds, and force us to begin to say, okay, this is the other. How can we come to an understanding of it? And then, only on that basis, evaluate and accept or reject, in part or in whole or whatever. How does that challenge us? How does that not only not become absorbed within our own worldview, but challenges it, which then expands it? That's the key. And the so-called past is like that. The past is a foreign culture. So often we approach the past as simply, family history. Oh, this is where we've come from. Isn't that cool? Isn't that neat? And absorb it all into our own minds, within our own worldviews. But that's missing the point, because the point is the past is a foreign thing. It is the other, whether we're talking about the colonial United States, or we're talking about ancient Rome, we're talking about what was going on in the 16th century Europe. It's the other, and we need to appreciate it that way. In some ways, this all comes down to my paternal grandmother, my father's mother, who was not a religious person at all, that I could tell, at least growing up. My mother's parents were, but my father's parents were not. But my grandmother did have this little cheeky plastic plaque on the wall. And this is going way back, so it is completely not politically correct or anything else. It was called an Indian prayer. I do not know the origin of this. I'm not talking about the cultural appropriation of Indians. Call them Native Americans, whatever you want. We don't even realize what tribe it was from, and I don't know the origins or anything else. But I think it makes a very good point. And it went like this: Lord, grant that I may never criticize my brother until I have walked a mile in his moccasins. Now, I'm not going to say much more about the plaque. I hope you know the context in which I saw it and how it impressed me as a child growing up. And also that I realized all the problems involved in that. Okay. But the essential point, may I not criticize my brother until I've walked a mile in his moccasins, is important for what I'm trying to get at. Can we ever know what someone else feels like walking in their own shoes? No, we cannot. We can only know what we feel when we're walking in their shoes. By walking in their shoes, we can somehow try to glimpse what they might experience walking in their shoes. If they don't fit, if they're, whatever, if they're uncomfortable, we get a sense of that, even if they may have a different experience. In some ways goes back to also a fundamental principle of, my view, a great cultural anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, in his famous essay From the Native's Point of View, going and studying indigenous peoples and things. And he said, we can never really grasp the native's point of view. We can never see things as a native sees them. Natives, i.e., indigenous individual. So, but what we can strive to do is see things through the same lenses. That is the big point. It is not to see the other through our own lenses, our own glasses, but to strive to see the other through their glasses. What are the lenses with which they view the world? Let's take ours off, put theirs on, and see what we can see and why. Now, we can never see things the way they do. We'll never be able to do that, or any other individual. But we can strive to say, okay, if I can take my glasses off, at least momentarily, put theirs on, what do I see? Because all of a sudden, I'm not looking from my own perspective, but through another perspective. That is the key for anthropology. That is the key to history. That is the key to approaching the other. And that is also why this failure thesis was so important, because it forced scholars to take off their own glasses and to put on another pair, to see it from a different perspective. And that brings me then finally to the grand narrative. Well, when Gerald Strauss published his book, Luther's House of Learning, putting forward the failure thesis, it sent shockwaves through the community of scholars, Reformation scholars. Reformation scholars traditionally had been from the field of church history, from the field of theology. A lot of them were themselves, I'll say, confessional in that they had a strong Christian belief. Then you had a minority of those who were coming from the Catholic perspective, with a very theological, confessional Catholic view of things. And that was how it kind of went. That Protestant scholars would, being Protestant, would study the Reformation and would see it in those terms. Catholic scholars would study the Reformation and see it in those terms. Was there development over the years? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Protestant scholars became far more nuanced, became far more understanding. It wasn't the fierce polemic of battle that these positions kind of grew out of from the 16th century itself. And they began to have a more nuanced view. Catholic scholars, too. I mean, you'd have and I think I wrote about this maybe somewhere, a Catholic Luther scholar, and there were some very good ones, very good Catholic Luther scholars, who still said Luther was wrong. Could come to the point where Luther was right about a lot of things, and the church did have a lot of problems, and there was corruption and everything else. But they say, but, okay, a Protestant scholar could get to the point of saying, yeah, Luther was crude. He was bombastic. He jumped the gun. Was too quick out the door, so to speak. Was arrogant and self-centered and everything else. But a Protestant scholar could not say that Luther was wrong, and a Catholic scholar could not say Luther was right, at least on this fundamental point. A Protestant scholar could say that Luther was right about a lot of things, or wrong about a lot of things, but not in the fundamental issues. A Catholic scholar could say that Luther was right about a lot of things, but not in the fundamental issues. And for a Protestant scholar, What Luther did and what the Reformation unleashed was a transformation of the medieval world, of medieval Christendom, of the tyrannical authority of the papacy, based on, in some ways, Luther's own view of the Middle Ages. Um, and medieval scholars were not usually Reformation scholars. Reformation scholars did not know all that much about the Middle Ages except what they would read back into it. And so they saw it as a very much a positive step forward. Catholic scholars traditionally saw it as the event that tore asunder the seamless robe of Christ. When it comes down to it, that's, even if Luther was right about a lot of things, that final ripping and tearing instead of mending should not have happened. A Catholic scholar would never have posed the thesis or the question of whether the Reformation was a failure, because they just knew it was very successful in destroying the church, in their view. It did its job. A Protestant scholar, would never have posed that question, because obviously it was a positive, it was a good thing, it brought in modernity and individuality, which I've argued whatsoever. It's always been interpreted that way. And that's a positive, and that's a good thing. Of course it succeeded, because look at us today. Strauss, who I think was actually Protestant, I think I mentioned he was also at Bloomington, down in Bloomington. So he's more of a social historian rather than a theological historian or a church historian. And he just poses that question. That was his research question, based on these new records that have come up, the visitation records. What do they tell us? And if we pose the question, was the Reformation a success? On what basis do we answer that? Not what we think. That's what will get us nowhere. Look at the centuries of scholarship arguing back and forth between Protestant and Catholic scholars about about the Reformation, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. If we come to this as saying we know the Reformation was a success, we just have to then deal with it, or we know it was destroyed the church, we're not going to really understand it. On what basis do we determine success or failure? And if it's on our terms, that's a theological interpretation. It's not an historical interpretation. So Strauss said, let's go back and try to discern what the criteria would have been based on the Reformers' own terms, based on what Luther talked about, wrote about, expected, what Melanchthon talked about, wrote about, expected, and on that basis, determine whether it was a success or failure based on these new documents that have come to light, the visitation records. And then he said, on that basis, we can only say it was a failure, because it did not bring about what Luther and Melanchthon at all intended and hoped. Now, that causes a shock. All of a sudden, what? The Reformation was a failure? Protestant scholars would ask. Catholic scholars would say, we knew it all along, but it didn't seem to be a failure because it did a really good job. It was absolutely wrong, but did a really good job at being wrong. A different question, which caused people to react, and there was very fierce reaction against Strauss. He had to defend his thesis several times. It's one of those theses that made a huge impact because it shook up how we conceive of things. It forced Reformation scholars to get out of their own minds, Catholic and Protestant both, to refocus the question with which we approach the sources. That's what getting out of your head means. Being shook to realize that the way you think things were and are, what we assume to be the proper questions actually aren't. And all of a sudden we're confronted with something that freaks us out because they're like, what? No, that can't be. But it's just a question. It's just a question and a position and an argument. It's like, wow. Okay, let's ask, how did Strauss come to those conclusions? And then you have to study his work, ask, of his books, because he's dead and gone now, you know, what's he basing his arguments on? What's he basing his positions on? That all comes back to the sources. And then we can look at a number of factors. And I think I've already mentioned the fact that the genre of visitation records can be problematic, because I said it would be like judging the success of a school based on visits to the principal's office. It's looking at the negatives. That is one problem. Now, that doesn't mean because there is a problem in the inherent in the genre of sources that Strauss was analyzing that his position is wrong. It just means we have to be more nuanced and look at it and interpret those documents within a broader context. Another aspect that actually, my advisor, Heike Obermann, put forward was that, okay, Luther put these ideas of what, of course, would hoped to happen, but he also hoped and knew that the end of the world was coming, number one, and he expected the devil to be attacking everywhere. He even says, the devil attacks more fiercely wherever the pure gospel is being preached, and that's why we're having all the problems we're having. So that for Obermann, it's like Luther did not expect success. He expected failure. And the success, what little successes along the way were there and were celebrated even by Luther and Melanchthon in the group, was purely due to the grace of God, intervening in staving off or fighting off the attacks of the devil. Because previously the devil was doing just fine, thank you very much. We were all going along our way. And then with Luther, it's like, oh my God, that's what's going on. And so we start preaching the pure gospel, and the devil goes, uh-oh, my nice, safe, comfy position is being threatened now. I have to crush it. So in some ways, Obermann's view was, in response to Strauss, was, well, okay, you can point to the things that Luther, in terms of his intent of what it would do, what the new catechism would do, what the new church ordinances would do and things. But you know what? When it comes down to it, he expected to be attacked by the devil. He expected the end of the world. That's what he was really expecting. All right, fair point. Okay, so you have to make sure that we include that then in Strauss's thesis. And all of a sudden, this question, this is a general, almost law of history. This question elicited such response, such new research, an attempt to disprove it, to undermine it, to reframe it, that it moved scholarship forward to a greater, more sophisticated understanding than almost any, I won't say that almost any other work. No, that's not quite true whatsoever. But it was a major impetus for the development of scholarship and the development of our understanding. And it was based on shocking people out of their own heads. Now, that's that. And this then brings me then to what is it now? The third point, the grand narrative. Because what is in our heads? What is in our heads is a story. We often can say, or it's often been said, that history is a story. It's the stories we tell about ourselves, about our worlds, to ourselves, to give meaning to ourselves. Now, I would equate that very closely with memory. And to make this argument more complete, you'd have to read my On History, not just the essay that I posted for this week, but that will also, I think, help fill in some of the argument here. Memory is always of the present. You say, no, wait a minute, memory is always of the past because we remember what's already happened. Well, yes, okay. But we always remember in the present. I can remember what I did yesterday. I can remember that yesterday I remembered to do something. But can I remember what and how I remembered yesterday? No, that's gone. I can only remember what I remember right now. And what is memory? Memory is a story. It's a partial story. It can be an overarching story. Who are we? Who am I? That's a story. That's something that we create in our heads in this grand narrative of who we are. which is comprised of all the little narratives of individual events. And over time, of course, we forget, we repress, we pretend things didn't happen and all those other things. But when it comes down to it, it's all a narrative structure. A narrative structure imposes a pattern. It imposes what, in the essay anyway, I refer to as an emplotment, because it's based on an emplotment. I assume you all know the term plot. Maybe some of you, maybe most of you, maybe all of you already know the term emplotment. It's from literary theory, and it analyzes how a plot is constructed and put together. Because you can tell the same story in different ways. You can start at the end and then go back to the beginning and then skip around and go, or you can start at the very beginning and go from point A, chronologically or sequentially all the way to the point Z. You can start in the middle and go forward and backward in every way you want. There's all kinds of different ways to emplot the quote unquote same story. And I say quote unquote same story because the story's changed based on its emplotment. We do that for ourselves individually, just naturally. We do that in terms of placing ourselves within our world. You could tell me all stories about why you took this course. You can tell me the stories about your career at IU and which campus you're at and why you're there and how it was that you came to be there. And all those stories would be narratives. Analysis is a different structure than narrative. Narrative skews based on emplotment. But yet, analysis without narrative doesn't have a lot of meaning as such. It just breaks things apart and looks and analyzes how things are put together. We can analyze a narrative, which is not the same thing as seeing the meaning of a narrative. It can become very problematic. And the point here is just I want to make that distinction between narrative and analysis. And they need to go together because narrative without analysis can be very skewing and warping. And without evidence, the evidence of what is real and extant and still exists, it reaches the realm of fantasy and hallucination. That's why evidence is so important. Doesn't mean we all agree on what the evidence signifies or means, because meaning is that which we attribute to the evidence. A text, Luther's 95 Theses, doesn't mean a thing in and of itself. It only means something when we read it and interpret it. The same thing with all the other texts, the same thing with all the artifacts, the same thing with all the ruins that still exist. They don't mean anything until we give them meaning by interpreting them. Analysis focuses on the artifacts themselves, on the texts themselves, etc. Whereas narrative then attributes meaning. A grand narrative is the overarching structure. That too is a term of literary theory. There's a very good book, Quentin Skinner, called The Return of Grand Narrative. It was published in the early 90s, I think. Because for a while this concept of a grand narrative in history was under attack, and rightly it should be, because a grand narrative is being like the United States was founded by these people arguing for individuality and getting away from the tyranny of George III, looking for religious freedom, and they come to the New World and establish colonies. They establish freedom. And they established the separation of church and state and individuality. And this is an experiment in individualism and the self-made man, so to speak. Yes, sick, not woman or child yet. Self-made man. And we are promoting democracy and freedom and capitalism to the world. And everybody is seeing how successful we are and all want to be like us. That is a grand narrative. And that is a very almost banal, short version of it, but you can see it can be worked out in far more detail and far more sophistication, even though it's the same grand narrative. What is that grand narrative? It's a problem for us individually because the grand narrative is almost the same as our identity. How do we conceive of ourselves? Who are we? That we tell a grand narrative to ourselves about who we are, and we try to then tell that same grand narrative to the world, even if we know better, in part. Countries have grand narratives, cultures have grand narratives, historical events, historical developments have been placed within grand narratives. And for the Reformation, there had been some competing grand narratives, but still grand narratives. We can say the Protestant narrative, grand narrative, and the Catholic grand narrative. And within there, maybe some more individualized ones as well. Still, overall, I guess back to the issue of the Protestant scholar being able to say Luther had some real issues and problems, but when it comes down to it, he was right. And the Catholic scholar saying, well, Luther was right about a lot of things, but when it comes down to it, but he was wrong. Those are grand narrative schemes. And what Strauss did was say, you know what? Let's try to get beyond that and ask a different question. Let's try to break into that grand narrative and ask the question, was the Reformation a success or a failure? You know what? When we look at it based on its own terms, the Reformation was a failure. That shook people out of their own grand narratives. That is the purpose and function and importance of Strauss's work, and that is the importance and function of the question or the assertion, the failure of the Reformation. That's why I'm spending so much time on this, because we all come to this topic with grand narratives in our heads already. Some of you maybe have never really heard much about the Reformation, just thought it might be curious, or heard very little at all. Say, yeah, I've heard about it, but I really don't know what it is. Some of you may feel that you've known it very well, and we're looking forward to knowing it more and more and more. I want to make it foreign. That has been my attempt in this course thus far, and will continue to be. Try to make it foreign to you, so we can begin to strive to see it with the lenses of the time. How do we understand it from the lenses of the time, or what Geertz would say from the native's point of view, even though we can't ever get that, but we can perhaps try to see it with the same lenses through which the natives viewed it. That's the key. That's the endeavor. To do that, we have to get out of our own minds. We have to be shocked out of it. That's why this question is important. It's not trying to undermine anything. It's not trying to dismiss anything. It's not itself a polemical position whatsoever, even though scholars tried to turn it into that. It is trying to say we need to reset the debate. We need to reset the questions we ask, because all research, whether it's historical research or scientific research or medical research, begins with a question. Questioning is the key. What was this? How do we know? Why did this happen? And there are questions that can only be answered by analysis. There's questions that can only be answered by narrative, by attributing meaning. The why question is probably the one most of all that deals with meaning, for which there's really no evidence to support. You cannot find evidence to support the position that Luther was divinely inspired and was putting forward the true understanding of the gospel, any more than you can put forward evidence that Luther was diabolical and didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, if you go back to the images that we talked about, Luther as the saint and the monk with the halo, the nimbus behind him, that could be one image. The other image is Luther as the devil's bagpipe. Those are both attributing meaning to Luther. There's no evidence to prove either is right or wrong. Well, you can prove that Luther wasn't the devil's bagpipe, because we have no evidence that anybody ever has been, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I hope you know what I'm meaning by this. So the point is to try to approach it all anew. Not to say, pretend like you're from Mars. I actually had a professor once in graduate school in a seminar. We were colloquially, we were reading Marcellus Apadua's Defender of the Peace. And he said, okay, I want you to pretend like you're from Mars and are seeing all this for the first time. What do you see? And I was like, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. That's not the point of this. The point is not to try to pretend that you are not who you are, that you don't have the experiences that you have, the beliefs and opinions that you have. The point is to try to recognize those and say, let's stop a moment and see if I take off my glasses and put on other ones, what can I see? If I view this not as familiar but as foreign, what do I see? That's the point. And it is to question the grand narrative that historians must continuously pursue by analysis, by research, by investigation, and by new questioning. And that is the importance of the failure thesis. It's not even important whether you say it failed or it didn't. That's not the important part. The important part is the question itself and trying to reframe the very basis of debate for coming to an understanding of this period and what it brought about. Now, one final section, measuring success and failure. The reason I just said it's not about your answer to that question, success or failure, it's because how do we measure it? On what basis do we measure it? Do we measure it based on what we think and feel and believe? Do we measure it based on what Luther thought and believed? Do we measure it based on what Melanchthon or what Calvin or what Butzer or what Oecolampadius, and you'll probably never hear me mention his name again. He was one of the reformers, Oecolampadius. On what basis do we make that determination? And what is the validity of that basis? You can say, well, yeah, if we start questioning that, then what is the basis for your grading our text analyses and our exams? Well, that's very clear for me. For me, that is the course material. How well have you grasped, understood, and are able to apply the course material? Okay? We have to find criteria for determining success or failure or most other questions. People say the Reformation was good. On what basis do you say that? What's the criteria that allow you to make that evaluation? Or if you say the Reformation was bad, on what basis do you make that evaluation? Is it your own opinions and beliefs? And then it gets to the issue of, well, yes, it is, and mine are as good as yours. Like, no, they're not. Not when we base ourselves on the extant evidence. Your opinions and beliefs and tastes are absolutely just as legitimate as mine when it's not an issue of evidence. If we could sit here and debate what's the best flavor of ice cream, is it vanilla bean or is it mint chip? I happen to like them both a lot, but I think I'd prefer vanilla bean. We could argue back and forth all day about that, but that would never get us anywhere because it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of opinion, individual taste and opinion. There's no evidence for either position. That's not what history is about, even if sometimes that's what it has become. What we can only argue about is what there's evidence for. And we can have disagreements. That's what scholars do. We disagree, we argue. But what do we argue on and about? The interpretation of the evidence that exists. There is some foundation in what is real and what is there that serves as the criterion or criteria for interpretation. Can there be alternative interpretations? Oh, yes. There's no alternative facts. There's no alternative truth. But there are alternative interpretations. Some are more valid than others, depending on what they are based on and the criteria for that determination and for that evaluation and for that interpretation. The same with the Reformation. The same with the question, was the Reformation a revolution? That's your final question for your final exam. What will be the criteria that you will use to make that determination? What will be the evidence that you will bring to argue your position? That's in some ways the point of all of this, to help prepare you for that final exam. Because that question, was the Reformation a revolution, is the same type of question as was the Reformation a success or failure. You have to define the terms. What constitutes a revolution? On what basis do you make that determination? What constitutes success? What constitutes failure? And on that basis, what's the basis for your determination of answering that question? Same thing with the final question for the final exam. You'll have to apply the course material, and we'll have to deal with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, because that's part of the course material. It's not asking if you agree with it or not. At least you have to show that you understand it and can apply it. It's not asking you whether or not that term, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, is valid or not. That's a similar maybe type of question, but it's not asking you that because you don't have the basis for answering that question. In this course, you need to know a lot more. And study the Reformation a lot more, the later Middle Ages a lot more, before you begin to have the basis, based on the evidence, to argue that question. But with the Revolution, that's a different type of question. You have to deal with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. You have to deal with Luther's Reformation and the Wittenberg Reformation, and the Martinian, or the Evangelicals. And so you have to deal with various patterns of the Reformation, whether it be Calvin and Calvinism, the Reformation in England, the Radical Reformation with the Catholic Reformation, and on we go, to deal with that question as well. Because it's not asking, did Luther unleash a revolution? Obviously, he certainly didn't want to do that, with the Peasants' War being evidence, or his attacking of the peasants and suppression of the peasants was there. As a little footnote, Karl Marx, I may have already said this when I talked about the Peasants' War. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Engels wrote this great important work on the Peasants' War. He said, it was a failed bourgeois revolution. It could have changed the whole course of German development, but otherwise it was crushed by the princes, and therefore Germany remained backward for the next 400 years, 300 years. It's an important question to ask. And I'll come back to this, talk probably a little bit more about this in the last lecture. Again, to help prepare for your final exam, I wanted to present some of this here now, kind of looking back on where we have been, and then looking forward to where we're going from here in the course as we begin this transition to patterns of the Reformation. Because how we conceive of it all affects how we understand it all. So questioning our conceptions, questioning the grand narratives we already bring to it, will help with coming to a newer, deeper, broader understanding of what extant evidence signifies. On that basis, then, to come to an interpretation of what the extant evidence means. It means for understanding of what happened over 400 years ago, or 400 years ago, give or take. So, that makes sense. That is what we're hoping to try to give you the opportunity to take off your own glasses and put on others. See it differently than what you see when you approach it from this perspective. It's not an issue of right or wrong. Your final exam is not to say, nope, you missed it. You said it wasn't a revolution, and actually it really was. That's not the point, any way, shape, or form. It is pose the question and see where it takes you. And to do that, you need to define your criteria and your evidence. That is what this is all about. Because by doing so, we will expand our mind, not by simply absorbing everything into our own, but by allowing us to get outside of our own minds, to recognize the other, to see ourselves in relationship to that other, rather than simply trying to make the other in relationship to us. That's what this is all about. So, that being said, in the next lecture, we start then with John Calvin, new part of the course, and we will continue from there, even as these conceptual issues will remain and have been there all along from day one of the course until your final examination. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.